It was first thing Sunday morning when an elderly man looked out the window. He smiled, like this morning, as he appreciated what a lovely day it was. He always starts his day with breakfast and his daily devotion. As he slowly ate his porridge, he was reading through the commentary for that day. It took him a while to get dressed. Things that were once easy for him, now a little bit more difficult. However, he never thought, maybe I should start wearing something more comfortable or easier to put on. He's always worn a suit to church. It is important to him. As he puts on his shirt and his tie, he prepares himself for worship that morning. He looked at himself in the mirror and he checked that there were not any creases. He takes his comb out of his suit pocket and he tidies his hair. He looks at his reflection in the mirror with satisfaction. He is now ready to go to church to worship God. On the other side of town, there is a young lady who just woke up. She cursed the sun because it woke her from a good dream. But after shaking off her morning tiredness, she looked out the window and smiled. What a lovely day, she thought. They obviously lived in Scotland. They need to take it when they can. She was always pleased when the weather is bright and sunny because it means she won't be getting soaking wet today. She does her morning yoga, flicks through her iPad whilst having breakfast, catching up on the latest news. Once she'd finished, she reluctantly got herself ready for the day ahead. She grabbed the nearest clothes that she could find, gave them the quick sniff test, thought they smell fine, and puts them on. It only takes her a couple of minutes to get ready. She looks at herself in the mirror. She's happy that she looks presentable. There are not any food stains on her clothes, and she's ready to face the day. She brushes her hair a few times, then whizzes out the door on the way to her destination. The old man and the young lady live on the opposite side of town. He left his house a little earlier than her. As they walk along their street, they are blessed with the beautiful autumn day. The old man looks around. His eyes are twinkling with delight as he admires God's beautiful creation. He's amazed at the smallest detail, such as the acorn on the oak tree, which is held together by God's love, which hangs on a tree which may even be older than himself. He looks in awe and astonishment. As he walks towards his church, he takes his time just to enjoy being alive and spending time in God's abundant creation. The young lady was in a bit more of a hurry. She left the door a little bit late. She didn't give herself much time to get to the destination that she was heading for. As she walked briskly, she appreciated that she wasn't getting wet, and she thought about all of the things that she would be doing that day. She was lost in thought when she headed round the corner and walked straight into the man. As they bumped into each other, they both lost their balance. She was able to catch herself, being a bit more younger and nimble, but sadly he took a small tumble. Oh no, she thought. I can't believe that this has happened. I'm going to be late. But of course, as a good citizen, she thought, I best give him a hand. So she helped him to his feet, checked that he was okay, which he was. The old man smiled at the young lady, said no bother at all, it was his fault, he said. He had been busy admiring the beautiful view and forgot to look where he was going. She replied, no problem at all, it's a lovely day, isn't it? But then she saw that he dropped something. She picked it up. It was the Bible. She handed it to him and asked, are you on your way to church? Yes, he said politely. I'm on my way to worship in the Lord's house. She held back a smirk as she replied, I'm on my way to worship the big man too. They were both on the way to church. Ironically, the church that the old man was going to was a traditional church just round the corner from her house. She was on her way to the larger, more contemporary church, was around the corner from the old man's house. They both smiled at each other and they went on their way. As the woman walked towards the church, she thought about the old man in his smart clothes. He seemed like a lovely man, but she took pity on him. In her mind, he was an example of everything that was wrong with the church. Stuck in the past, she thought. More interested in trying to look righteous, she thought. She, on the other hand, was a Christian because God loved her. She didn't need to dress to impress. She was a Christian irrelevant of what clothes she wore. As she got into the church, she prepared herself to lead worship. She led the congregation in prayer as they prepared themselves also to worship the Lord. She prayed to God. This is what she said. She said, "Thank you, Lord, that you came and rescued us. Thank you that you rescued us from the burden of your law, that your law is abolished, that we are no longer slaves to your law, but we are free, that we can come before you, having stripped away our religious masks and being as we are." I also pray for the old man I walked past earlier. It was really sad. He was on his way to the church, which had been dwindling for so long. His suit betrayed how wrong they are getting things. Thank you that we are not like that church, she prayed, that we do not dress up in order to impress, as if you will be impressed. Thank you, Lord, that we come to you as we are. Amen. She thought it was a powerful prayer, and everyone was nodding in agreement. What a religious person she was. She has everything sorted. After leading the worship, she sat down in the comfy seats for the sermon. The minister went on to preach the sermon, and as she listened, she felt like God was really speaking to her that day, vindicating her feelings about the man. That day, the preacher continued her series on the Sermon on the Mount. In fact, she was at the exact same point that we are, which was such a coincidence. You really can't make this stuff up. As the passage was read out, the young lady heard the words of the passage, "Unless your righteousness exceeds that of the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." She thought back to the old man, and she thought, wow, God led me to bump into a Pharisee this morning. He was more interested in looking pious than loving God. She had goosebumps on her arms. To top it off, the preacher even compared the parable of the Pharisee and the religious leader and the tax collector to the passage. She read the passage in memory of Eugene Peterson in the Message version. This is Luke chapter 18, verses 9 to 14. And it says, Jesus told his story to some who were complacently pleased with themselves over their moral performance and looked down their noses at the common people. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee, the other a taxman. The Pharisee posed and prayed like this: "Oh God, I thank you that I am not like other people, robbers, crooks, adulterers, or even, heaven forbid, like this taxman. I fast twice a week and tithe on all my income." Meanwhile, the taxman slumped in the shadows, his face in his hands, not daring to look up, said, "God, give mercy. Forgive me, a sinner." Jesus commented, "This taxman, not the other, went home right with God. If you walk around with your nose in the air, you're going to end up flat on your face. But if you're content to be simply yourself and will become more than yourself, or you will become more than yourself." After hearing that, the lady thought, that man, not just an old man anymore now, that Pharisee, he was literally walking around with his nose in the air and he bumped into me and fell flat on his face. Maybe I'm a prophet, she mused. She wondered about this. She didn't really hear much more of the sermon that day as she dreamt about all the amazing things that she's going to be doing with her life, all the amazing things she'll be doing in God's name, what people will be thinking of her. She heard snatches of the sermon, which only seemed to reinforce her thoughts. As it was a modern church, the sermon was recorded on YouTube, so we're able to consider the full message. We don't need to rely on the fact that the lady stopped paying attention. The preacher began, as the young lady did, by looking at the Pharisees. After all, Jesus was definitely using the Pharisees as an example in both of the passages. The issue was the Pharisees were following the law, but in following the law, they broke the first commandment. Because although they were following the law, they made it so important in their lives that the law became their idol. They turned the law into their God. They devoted themselves to the law in such a way that they rewarded themselves for how obedient they are. It was thought that there were 246 commandments and 365 prohibitions in the Old Testament. And the Pharisees took pride that they knew all of them. And they kept so many of them so diligently that standard people would look up at them in awe. They would think, wow, how could they achieve such a holy life? 246 commandments recorded in the Old Testament and 365 prohibitions. If you want to count, I'd suggest you do that yourself and come back to me and tell me whether it's correct. But Leviticus would probably have a number of them in there. Jesus caused quite a stir in his ministry, however, as he seemed less focused on the law. In fact, in many ways, to the Pharisees, Jesus was a blasphemer of the law. For example, in Mark 2, the disciples began to pluck grain from a field on the Sabbath. And this was a day that the Jews would usually prohibit any sort of working on. So they saw this as an opportunity to challenge Jesus, to ask him about that. And Jesus, rather than rebuking the disciples, which is what they were expecting, he laid out a case that actually it was okay. He said the Sabbath was made for humankind and not humankind for the Sabbath. Also in Matthew 11, we learn that Jesus ate and drank with tax collectors and sinners. He was even accused by the Pharisees of being a glutton and a drunkard. Now, I can imagine he wasn't, but the sort of people that he was spending his time with was completely against everything that the Pharisees felt, because they needed to keep themselves pure, the religious leaders, ensuring that they could follow all of these laws. I mean, certainly if you compare Jesus to the Pharisees on a righteousness scale, the Pharisees, it seems, would have won. But also, there were cracks in the Pharisees. And as we can see in the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector, some of these cracks were quite big. It is worth us remembering that not all Pharisees were tarred with the same brush. When Jesus speaks negatively of the Pharisees, he's speaking about specific characteristics which sadly were all too common in the religious leaders of the day. In some respects, they were easy targets. But we learn from the Bible there were plenty of Pharisees who were diligent and did learn to walk with the Lord. But these Pharisees with cracks, they would go to the temple to gloat how privileged they were, how much better they were than the tax collectors and the sinners, how they kept all the laws. But their piety became their pride. Their law became their God. And the cracks in their facade increased until you could see into the hollowness of their heart. But obedience is not some tapestry that we weave around ourselves to make us look the part. That isn't what obedience is. It's not a cloak that we put on ourselves in order to impress other people. It is a change in attitude that starts in the heart. And the Old Testament confirms this. This wasn't a new thing that Jesus was talking about. It says in Jeremiah 31, "But this is the covenant that I make with the house of Israel after those days. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people." In Ezekiel, it says, "I will put my spirit within you and make you follow my statutes and be careful to observe my ordinances." The Bible confirms that obedience is changing our heart. It is reorientating ourselves towards God. And as we do this, as we reorientate ourselves towards God, as we follow his commands, he draws us into his presence. He blesses us. Even when we are at our weakest, he still blesses us. When the world values all the things that Christ doesn't, when we have to do things which may seem countercultural to some people, God continues to bless us in those things. He gives us the joyful resolve, the strength to do things in his name. He gives us the conviction that following him is worth it. Because Jesus did not come to abolish the law, which he said himself, but he came to fulfill it. The Pharisees, rather than seeing the law as a way of drawing closer to God, they worshipped it. And in so doing, they alienated themselves from God. The law became their God, and they just became further and further away from God. And you can see how easy it would be for them to fall into that trap. How easy that would have been for them to notice how much people put them on a pedestal because they're able to obey and follow so many of these various commands. However, that was until Jesus came. Because when Jesus came, in fulfilling the law, he changes the orientation between us and the law. Because Jesus came between us and the law. In following God's commandments, in fulfilling God's prophecies, in being in perfect communion with God, despite his limitations as a human, Jesus fulfilled the law perfectly. And whilst we can, through obedience, be drawn into God's presence, that on its own would not be able to fully restore our relationship with God. We cannot do that on our own. As the Pharisees would have found, no matter how many of them laws that they could follow, there still would have been multitudes that they just couldn't keep up with. Just the fact that we have to put effort into following God, something that should be as natural as breathing, proves this point. We are made to follow God. We are made to be obedient to him. And yet, time and again, it shows that we all too easily will go on our own way. And isn't that a tragedy of life? That even the things that we are most passionate about, our loved ones, our hobbies, whatever it may be, no matter how disciplined we are, we'll often notice that we'll never achieve what we hoped. Or in our obsession, we neglect other things. We neglect other areas of our lives which are so important. But Jesus, in his full humanity, was able to do something that we never could. He was able to be obedient to God, and he communed with him in a way that God intended humanity to. And after doing this, after being drawn fully into God's presence, Jesus performed a miracle. He reached out his hand to anyone else that would accept it. He reaches out as far as necessary, no matter where we are on our journey, His hand is there, reaching for us, beckoning us into his embrace. And in doing so, he restores our relationship with God. We cannot be righteous to the standard that God is. We cannot be so obedient that through our own strength, independently, that we can accept God's embrace. However, we learn from the passage that Jesus is our righteousness and that he pulls us into his embrace. Even more, when he calls us in, he pulls all of us into his embrace. And we will all struggle to be obedient. But as he brings us together in community, he also does that so that we can help each other. Because as our righteousness is complete in Christ, so it is complete in each other through pastorally caring for each other, for walking alongside each other, being accountable to each other. At the end of the sermon, because that was all that young lady's sermon, that wasn't mine. The minister's sermon, the young lady went away wondering, what has God have in store for her next? At that point, she'd all but forgotten about the old man. Her mind was squarely set on the future. The man, however, we haven't heard from him for a while. When he went to the church, he sat down on the hard pews. His old bones were creaking as he sat. He checked his suit was hanging correctly, and he prayed. He always prayed before the service started. He prayed, Lord, I am a sinner. Please have mercy on me. Please accept my devotion to you. Even though I am unworthy of your glory, please accept my worship to you. I know that my clothes might only look like tatters compared to the magnificence of your garments, but please accept my worship of you. As he prayed, his eyes welled. He was always overcome with emotion when he considered what Jesus had done for him. He continued to pray. I pray also for the young lady. She was such a beautiful person, and how my heart leapt when I heard she was going to your house. I pray that you will be a blessing, that she will be a blessing to you, Lord, and that her life will be fruitful for you. Amen. So who was the Pharisee and who was the tax collector? Because the young lady, she thought that she was a tax collector because she didn't dress to impress for the sake of it. But sadly, whilst reflecting on her own holiness, she missed so many fundamental points in the message. Instead, she dwelled in her own pride and forgot to listen to what was God's word saying to her that day. Because Jesus did fulfill the law, but in doing so, he did not diminish any part of it. In fact, as Jesus fulfilled it to every minute detail, he fulfilled it to the teat that distinguishes an R from a P. So a P is that bit, and then the teat is that bit. He ensured that every part, every letter, every stroke of the law was fulfilled perfectly. And in fulfilling the law, Jesus helped us to understand what the original purpose of the law was. It is not so that we can be legalistic and expect the impossible of each other. It is about the law about us allowing the law to transform us from the inside out. The law, outside of the heart, worn like a cloak, it is performative. It is an act that only pushes God further away from us. However, obedience of the heart, that is transformative. It may seem impossible, but as we aspire to follow the law, to be obedient to God's law, then we will be gradually transformed. We cannot fully achieve every word, every character, every stroke. Only Jesus could do that. But that doesn't give us permission to reduce the significance of the law. It does not give us permission to see the law as something old and legalistic, like the young lady thought when she looked at the man. She missed the point. She saw the elderly man's clothes as a sign of thinking that he was better than others, when in fact he wasn't. He was wearing what he felt was appropriate so that he could worship God in his fullness. For him, God deserves his utmost respect. Dressing up was a part of his obedience to God. Even though he was dressed up before God, as we learn from his prayer, he felt underdressed. But the young lady, she may have felt like the tax collector in her throw on clothes, but in fact, she was more like the Pharisee. Because even though she was wearing raggedy clothes which she just threw on, she was still dressing to impress. As crazy as that sounds, her clothes were making a statement in her mind. I encourage us to come to worship in whatever we feel is most appropriate without judgment. But more importantly, I encourage us to consider, are we glorifying God? Obedience is about being drawn into God's presence. It is about accepting the hand that Jesus is holding out for us. Let's not be one of those communities that diminishes the importance of God's law. It is not going anywhere. Why? Because the law describes the quality of God. It describes the characteristics of God. And more importantly, the law is a gift from God. And God didn't have to give it to us. He could have left Moses and his people to it. After all, we are all pretty good at creating all sorts of rules and regulations in church that did not come from the word. But the law is more than that. It is not a legalism that we wear. The law is a gift from God. It is a gift from God like praise, like the Psalms, like his word, like communion. He gives it to us so that we can participate in our life with him. He gives it to us so that we can give it back to him in worship. Why? Because these are the things he values, but more importantly, they characterize his holiness. They characterize what is worthy of him. And when spending time with God, we grow. There is something tangible about this obedience because it feeds us. Eugene Peterson, he described a lifelong obedience. He spoke of how it sustains us, how it transforms us. And believe me, I know as much as everybody else that it is really hard for us to do this on our own, no matter how appealing it sounds. But Jesus has already done it. He sits at the right hand of God in perfect communion with him. And rather than turning his back to us like we did to God, he is reaching out for us. He is willing us to accept his righteousness so that we can come before God. So as we now come to the table, we're going to be just listening and feel free to join in. It's My Hope is Built on Nothing Less, Christ Alone, Cornerstone. It will be playing on the video on the screen, which hopefully won't, for some reason, stop working today. It doesn't have the lyrics, so do find it in your praise books if you want to join in. And listen to the lyrics, take them to heart. My hope is built on nothing less than Jesus Christ's righteousness.